happens when you're selling your house and you need to stay a little bit longer than the closing? What is that called? Is it even possible? Fortunately, yes, there is a process for it. It's called a rent back, also known as a lease back. Let's take a closer look at how this works to see if it's going to be right for you. My name is Andrew Finney, and my passion is helping you make sense of real estate. If you need help finding a top agent near you, or if you simply want to drop me a line to say hello, my contact info is below. If you're new here, please go ahead and subscribe to this channel now and like this video. Thank you. Of course, my friend, this really depends on what side of the fence you're on. Obviously, if you're on the selling side, this could seem like a blessing in disguise or a saving grace. If you're the buyer, it could be like, oh my God, I really want to move into my new home. Why does the seller want to stay? Let's take a look at what happens here in this situation of a rent back, also known as a lease back. The first thing to understand is, why would a seller want to rent back anyways? Why would they want to become a tenant of the house they just sold? Well, it's reasonable to think that a seller is going to be also buying a new house or moving out of the area. Depending on whether that's a resale home or a new construction, you might have additional time that you're waiting to be able to close on your brand new construction, or waiting for the terms to be fulfilled in your new resale contract itself. And you're thinking, well, where am I going to go if my new house isn't ready to go and I don't want to really be homeless or stay in a hotel? Well, that's where the option comes in with the seller lease back or rent back. Generally, by working with the top trusted real estate advisor, you would have already had this conversation and played out these possible scenarios before you ever went on the market. And it's something that if it was negotiated up front with a buyer, or at least was tossed out saying, hey, you know what, we might need one. Is your buyer cool with that? It should not present a problem if that was the case. Consider the fact that we as people do absolutely wonderful with great news. We do okay with bad news or indifferent news as long as we know about it. But we do pathetically awful and pitiful if we don't have any news, and we get very darn angry. We don't like those last minute surprises. So please communicate openly and honestly with your trusted real estate advisor and make sure that everybody knows the situation moving into the closing process. That brings us to the second point. What's in it for the buyer and why should they care? From the buyer's perspective, they're probably thinking and scratching their head, well, do I really want to play landlord with the seller that I'm buying the house with? This is kind of bizarre. It's a little bit awkward. I'm not completely sure about this. Yet at the same time, what's in it for the buyer is the very real fact that if they're renting right now, and if they're a first-time home buyer, they probably are, or they're staying with their parents, then they have the time that they might need to be able to burn to be able to get out of that contract without having to pay money for breaking a lease, or it gives them additional time to prepare for their move. All the same, it's really interesting because it comes down to what are the buyer and seller motivations. In fact, I have seen a lot of sellers in real estate practice here in Las Vegas, Nevada, simply accept an offer because the buyer made it known they were willing to give the seller a lease back if needed. And with that lease back arrangement, it gave the seller peace of mind so they didn't feel so stressed out and so anxious when it came time to move into their new home, and help them be able to plan their next move even better. So what's in it for the buyer? Well, obviously, if you're going to be the tenant of the buyer that's purchasing your home, they expect to get paid. So the third thing is, how do we protect everybody's rights in this situation? Every situation is different, and all situations should be done in writing in the form of a contract. In fact, a lot of states may have forms that might be called seller in possession of the property, a leaseback arrangement. There's a lot of different types of forms. Here in Las Vegas, Nevada, we have one that's we use for leaseback situations, and we break down the terms to keep everything on the up and up between the buyer and the seller, and identify a host of things that are important to both by understanding what's most important to them, and we come to the middle ground with something that's agreeable and amenable to both the buyer and the seller in this situation. There are usually 13 different components of such an agreement. Let's take a look at them. The first one is the term of the rental period. Now, it is important to note, depending on what kind of a rental period that you're looking for as a seller, it may or may not work with the buyer's loan. If that buyer is purchasing the property with the intent of moving in, they're what is known as a primary owner occupant. With a primary owner occupant loan, they may only have 60 to 90 days maximum before they must take possession of the property pursuant to the lending guidelines. So that's something to think about. And going back to how most states have these forms, most of them are going to be for 60 days or less. In fact, it's more common that people do a leaseback arrangement for 30 days or less. All the same, in your leaseback arrangement, you'll want to specify the exact period of time to make sure that everybody's agreeable going forward. The second thing to consider is, how much will the rent be and how will it be paid? Essentially, we'll want to break this out on a per diem basis. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. The third thing to consider is, will there be a security deposit? If so, how much? The fourth thing is, where will that security deposit go? Will it be held in the escrow company and then given to the buyer upon a successful closing? Or will the money be going directly directly to the buyer. The fifth thing to consider is, will there be any late charges if there's any payments that are missed or pertaining to non-sufficient funds in the seller's account? The sixth consideration is, who's going to be paying for the utilities? The seventh is the buyer's right of entry to the property. Generally, they would have a 24 to 48 hour notice that they could give to you, the seller, to be able to gain access into the property. We want to specify that time frame and ensure what the reasons are that could cause them to be able to come by and check out the property. Normally, this would be in like an emergency case, or perhaps the buyer is getting ready to move into the home and is out shopping for furniture, which would be very gracious of you at that point to make their new home available to them so they can take the measurements needed to get their new furniture. The eighth thing, what are the expectations of you, the seller, to maintain the property during this period? The ninth thing to consider is, who is assigned to the lease, and is there any subletting that will be allowed? The 10th is the seller's obligation to surrender the property underneath specified circumstances and situations. The 11th is the seller's insurance for their personal belongings and their automobiles. You'll want to have that conversation with your insurance agent so that it'll be different than your homeowner's insurance. You actually might want to look at a short-term rental insurance to ensure that your personal belongings and your automobiles are covered. The 12th is any miscellaneous conditions agreeable to the seller and the buyer at the time. These could encompass a lot of different things. So it really depends on what's in the mind's eye of the seller, what's in the mind's eye of the buyer, and then simply putting it in the writing so that everybody agrees once both signatures are done. The 13th thing to consider is, how will the rent be paid? Will it be paid in advance, or will it be paid in arrears? Will it be the seller writing the check directly to the buyer, or will the funds be held into the escrow account? I can share with you in real estate practice, every leaseback situation that I've negotiated for a seller that needed to stay in the property was always best practice to have a portion of their net proceeds left in the escrow account and then paid to the buyer in arrears if that buyer was agreeable to those terms. Paid in arrears because oftentimes we don't know exactly how much time you might need. We might say that we need a 30-day lease back, but in reality, maybe you get out in 15. If it's paid in arrears, it's easy enough to prorate out those 15 days and for the escrow company to cut a check to the buyer, and then you get the remaining 15 days of prorated rent back. It's the easiest way to do that because once you release those funds to a buyer, they're pretty much gone, and it would be on good faith. And a lot of buyers would be happy to give you back the prorated amount, but what happens if they've already spent the money? Best practice here is to keep everybody safe by having the money held in the escrow account and paid out in arrears. All the same, it's up to the parties in this negotiation of how that's going to work. The fourth thing to consider are the seller's insurance requirements. We briefly touched on that a moment ago, where it's extremely important to ensure that you have either some form of a rental coverage or getting with your insurance agent to ensure that you have adequate coverage. Thinking that you can leave your homeowner's insurance active during that time that you're in the property seems like a really good idea, but here's the possible problem with that. Your homeowner's insurance was for you during the time that you own that property. The buyer also have homeowner's insurance on that property since they're the new legal owner of that property. What happens if something unfortunately did befall the property where homeowner's insurance would be needed? Then it would be looked upon at your homeowner's insurance as the former owner of that property that would be expected to pay. But your insurance company may have a different thought process. The insurance company may be looking to the new buyer who's the new legal owner of this property that says, hey, they need to pay because they own the property. To prevent this issue, the easiest thing to do is to have this conversation aloud between you and your agent and the buyer of your property. Simply put, it's probably best just to simply get renter's insurance for that short amount of time that you'll be there. The fifth thing is deciding on how much the rent will be. Having done this several times in Las Vegas, Nevada with the clients that I've represented, I can share with you that it is the best and fairest practice to ensure that the buyer is made whole during this process. The easiest way to ensure that the buyer not only will agree to the rent back, but to keep them whole and happy throughout the process is to let them know that the amount of rent will be the amount of whatever their new monthly mortgage is. Now consider the fact that when you bought this property, you would have had probably a different mortgage amount than the buyer's incoming mortgage. Depending on the market conditions, whether the market's going up or whether the market is going down, could ultimately mean that the buyer's mortgage may be higher than what you're currently paying, or it could be less than what you're currently paying. All the same, best practice here to keep everybody happy is to ensure that that monthly amount that they're paying in their principal, their interest, property taxes, homeowner's insurance, and the HOA fees are covered during the leaseback period. So let's take a closer look at the calculations that go into how this would play out. Let's say that the buyer's monthly mortgage is a total of $3,000 a month. Well, if we average out 30 days in a month, we would take the $3,000, divide it by 30, and that would leave us with $100 a day on a per diem basis. Then let's say that the rental period that we had in mind was for 45 days. We would take the 45 days and multiply it by the 100 to come up with the total rent amount. 45 times 100 is $4,500 for the total rent amount. Now the other consideration that we might have is an HOA. Let's say your HOA is $100 a month. We'll want to apply the same fundamentals to this, but come up with a prorated per diem basis. So when we're looking at the per diem basis, we would take the $100 and monthly HOA fee divided by 30 days in a month. It comes out to a per diem basis of $3.33. Now you would take your 45 days for your rental period and multiply it by the 333, and you will come to $149.50, bringing the total amount for the rental period in the leaseback arrangement to $4,649.50. That's the amount of money that you would like to have held in suspense in the escrow account and paid to the buyer, ideally on an arrears basis. Okay, so now that you know how to make better sense of a leaseback, what it is, why it happens, and how to break out the numbers, let's take a closer look at what you should know about home selling contracts and 4 steps to buying a house while selling one. Looking forward to our next conversation. We'll see you in a few.